Welcome to my Dear Kitchen in Helsinki podcast. My guest this week is William LaFleur, an anthropologist and researcher currently working on his doctoral studies at the University of Helsinki. He is also an enthusiastic food geek. Will is using sensory ethnography as a new method for learning sustainability and understanding local foodways. He and I invite you to a sensory discussion which involves a baguette and a börek, and we urge you to do a sensory experiment the next time you're eating something. Hope you enjoy.
Hey there, Asli.
Hi.
How's it going?
Well, I'm hungry. I've been waiting for this interview to have my lunch.
Yeah, well, apologies for being a little bit late. I was just waiting for this batch of baguettes that I've just baked, or attempted baguettes that I've just baked, which I've got here in my hand. You can see it. Obviously, the people who are listening can't see it, but this is a baguette. It's a sourdough baguette, which I've been working on for the last year or so, on and off. Baguettes are really hard to make at home. So you have to make them small, for example, because nobody has a home oven that can accommodate like the really long baguettes that you might see in the store. But yeah, I'm going to start eating this baguette because I'm pretty hungry, as I'm sure you are. You also brought some food, right?
Yes, I have here. I can't hold it in my hand really because it's quite big and it's also a bit greasy. Mine. It's a filo börek, like the savory, the general name for savory pastries, and you can see part of it is a bit too brown, maybe because of my oven. Like the one corner of my oven is heating a bit too much, but I think I like it. Sometimes, I mean, in a pastry, I like it even more like that, to be honest.
Okay.
And the filling, it's some of the old flavors, but a new combination. So let's see. I mean, I do this kind of pastries a lot because it's a very basic part of Turkish cuisine. But I use a different filo here. In Turkey, we use fresh filo. And mostly round shaped and bigger size, but here I use baklava dough.
Okay, yeah, that kind of. Yeah.
And I actually learned how to work with it so much better now than the other one, and it creates crispier results actually. So
well, crispy is great, and actually, so when I first started making baguettes, my friend who's French, he said, "Oh, did you know that if you want to become a baker in France, your final test is to make a baguette." Oh. That's like the final test, which the implication is that it's super, super difficult to make. And I've been asking my friends who have knowledge of what a baguette should be like, and obviously it's always up for debate even in France. But there seem to be a few bakers that have described the sort of ideal sensory characteristics of baguette, which maybe we can explore right now. So, like, for example, the crust, it should be like, if you just touch it, it might be like it's really hard, but then when you squeeze it, it's also supposed to make like a really crackling sound. And so let's try to see if you can hear this.
Oh yes, I can perfectly.
Okay, yeah, that sounded pretty good to me. So it should have that hard but thin crust, so it's like really crispy, and then inside should maybe be really. Okay,
I'm melting here.
And then inside should be like really soft and fluffy. And if you can see, it's like, oh yeah, it's kind of stretching a little bit. Well, and the steam, wow, that looks really nice.
Oh, with all the holes and everything.
Yeah, it's really, it rose really well, although it might be, well, we'll see. But so then
And just one thing in between, the sourdough starter is something is yours. Like did you take it from someone, or did you start it yourself?
Yeah, so my partner and we made it when we first moved to Finland. So about 3 years ago.
Okay.
We made it from rye flour, Finnish rye flour here, and we made it in Oulu. And actually, I was watching this guy who runs this sourdough library in Belgium, and he was saying that the most, when you make a sourdough starter, the water that you use when you first create it is the most important factor in like its trajectory, like its development or its living continuation as a starter. So we were up in northern Finland. We use that water there, which is really good water. Yeah. And so now it's about 3 years old now, and I feed it every day. I keep it on my counter because I bake a lot.
Yeah.
And oh god, sorry, I gotta put this. I gotta eat this. So.
Oh my god.
Wow. So like, you can just eat the baguette, and there's no topping. It's just made from flour, salt, water, and the sourdough, the leaven. But actually, when you eat it, it somehow almost tastes like there's butter on it. It's like already buttery. However, I did bring some butter with me here, which I'm going to put on along with some honeycomb. And if you put on straight, like raw honeycomb, it then melts into the bread and the butter, and it's really, really delicious. So I'm going to do that right now.
In the meantime, I have to start eating too. So
what's the filling in your, what filling do you have?
So in it there is, first of all, this is 15 sheets of phyllo, put in different kinds of layers. And in it there are 2 types of cheese, feta and grated Gouda, and then sun-dried tomatoes and fresh basil. Wow. I actually wanted to use fresh tomatoes. I'm not always the biggest fan of the texture of sun-dried tomatoes in the mouth. But, well, I thought, the fresh tomatoes might have a little bit too liquid and might make inside the phyllo a bit too soggy, I thought. So instead I just use sun-dried tomatoes. And let's try to hear the flakiness of my pastry.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, this is the upper part. And the thing is, this crispiness and flakiness causes a little bit of a mess when you're cutting and eating. But I like the mess it creates, and the little upper, the crispiest parts falling down. You can just take them and eat this kind of very crispy thin layers of dough. So let's cut it.
Yeah, that sound. My mom used to make what she called spanakopita, which I guess is the Greek version, right?
I think it's
and that sound that you just made just reminds me exactly of that sound. It was like one of my favorite dishes when I was growing up.
Yeah. So. I think spanakopita is, I think, especially the one with spinach and feta.
Yeah.
So, and normally this kind of böreks in Turkish cuisine are very common, but people I think nowadays are trying new kinds of fillings like what I did, but the most basic one is the one with white cheese, which is similar to feta, but not exactly, and parsley. Just mix these two and you'll be fine. Although I like mixing with different types of cheese. And I think you can see that there are some different kinds of layers.
Oh, that looks amazing.
So what I do is I have a 20 to 30 centimeters oven dish. And well, the sheets are, of course, bigger than that. So some sheets I just use flat, some parts extending from the oven dish. But then in between, some I just pull apart and create different kinds of bumps and layers. So that I used to do it so that every layer is very flat. But then I realized that the result after it especially gets cooler, the pastry goes a bit down when you do that. So instead I found this method, and now I'm going to eat it. It's quite greasy on the outside. Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah. So the first thing that hits me is sun-dried tomatoes.
The first thing that hit me was that crunch.
Yeah. Well, I think that if I bite from the corner, now I got the crunch. And I didn't use a lot of fresh basil, but I can still get the refreshing taste of the basil a little bit, and I think it was quite right amount.
Nice. Okay. I love that when you eat the thing that you've just made, you're not exactly sure how it's going to taste, but that feeling of like, oh, it's just the right amount of this ingredient.
Yeah.
Because or it's like, or the thought is, oh God, I put way too much salt in it or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, baking is in that sense, I think, more exciting, isn't it? Because in cooking, you can always, I'll add a bit more spice or a bit more salt. But when you're baking, you just put in the oven and then wait for the result. You can't take out your cake in the middle and say, it's not, it's,
That's so true.
And that's why I think, baking is kind of like a science project. Like you have to do the right measurements, and my mother has this eye measurement, which I hate because it's impossible to get any recipes from her. But for me, baking is more like exact measurements. And
I have to say, like, that's before I started baking, really, which was only about 3 years ago when I moved to Finland. That's what everyone says, and of course there's truth. That's fairly true, but I've found that at least with baking with sourdough, I think, for example, cakes would be a completely different story.
Yeah.
But baking with sourdough, I find it. Yeah, of course you have to be, and I weigh things out in grams and stuff like that, but I find that there's a lot more work that I've had to develop, like skill in my hands that I've had to develop, and in that way, it feels more like an art rather than just a science. It's like some kind of nice combination between the two, because of the way that you handle the dough, the way that it gets folded, the way that I do the kneading, for example, and the way that I roll it up into the final shape. All of that matters in the, when it gets baked, it shows in the final product. Like this one of the baguettes that was on the tray just now, it did what I like to call a dali, which is one of the ends of the baguettes. One of the baguettes was too long, so one of the ends drooped over the edge. So when it came out, it was like a Salvador Dali painting.
Yeah.
Like the drooping thing. And every little thing kind of matters in the final way, but it's there's really no standard way it comes out. It always comes out differently. And in that way, I feel like it's this whole process of putting together this thing and shaping it in a way to get some sort of shape, but you never really know what shape it's going to be or how it's going to turn out.
Yeah, I agreed with that very much, especially with bread, or anything that needs also a little bit kneading, like buns also, for example. And for example, for my blog, when I'm giving recipes with that, I try to explain it so that you cannot rely exactly on my measurements. Because also the flour you use changes a lot, the final product. Like somebody that is using the same flour that I am here might follow exact measurements with me, but then again, you know, I have readers from all over the world. Like someone using a flour in the US may have to deal with a little bit different consistency and amounts.
Yeah. And even I find in Finland, you know, like there's the vehnäjauho, which is like the standard kind of all-purpose flour. Even, you know, it depends on the brand that I get or the farm that I'm getting it from. Every single vehnäjauho is different.
Yeah.
Like if I try to make the same bread with the same flour, it's always a different thing. So now I've discovered like certain flour from certain places that I like a lot more, even though, you know, ostensibly it's the same kind of flour. That's actually been one of the biggest learning experiences with baking. But also, like, I don't know, I was just smelling this baguette and tasting it and thinking about you know, even though it's made with sourdough, before I knew much about sourdough, I just figured it's like sour bread, like it's bread that turns sour. But actually, in this baguette, there's no sourness at all.
Yeah.
And in some cases, for things like baguettes, or if it's like a cinnamon roll, for example, you don't really maybe you want a tiny tang, but you don't really want it sour. And the trick to make sure that it's not sour has taken me, you know, 2.5 years to figure out. But this baguette is not sour at all. And I started feeling the name in English is so misleading because it's, you know, it's just sourdough, but it doesn't mean it's sour. And in fact, I mean, I was taking this lecture on bread history, and this baker quoted in the 18th century in France, talking about how awful it is to have sourness in your bread, and like ways to make, you know, this levain, the sourdough bread, not sour. And now I'm starting to get pretty good at it. It's kind of like, I'm pretty happy.
And talking about bread, actually, you have a this critical bread co. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Critical Bread Co. Was born out of I would attribute its birth to the long dark winters of the Finnish north, the Nordic north. I spent a lot of time at home. You know, before I moved to Finland, I was living in Tokyo, and most of my time was spent outside the house. But moving to Oulu, it's much smaller, and I spent a lot more time at home. And that's when I started baking, and I really fell in love with it. It's such a challenge every time to make something that you really enjoy out of this bread. You know, it's like we said, like we were just talking about, it's like a surprise every time. And then so I started making pizza. Pizza was like the thing that I really was interested in making, and eventually it started getting pretty good. And my friends kept saying, "Oh man, you should have like a pop-up restaurant." Like, you know, I wasn't really thinking about doing that kind of thing. But over time, and as I kept doing it, and I was nearing the end of my studies of the master's degree I was doing, it became clear that there was going to be like at least a semester where I didn't have school, and I needed to find some way to make a little money. So then I was talking with my partner, and we thought like, well, maybe we could sell bread to like my friends or something like that. And I ended up getting connected with one of the cafes at University of Oulu, the student-run cafes, and they, I baked them some cookies, and they were like, yeah, we can sell your bread and cookies at our cafe. Mm-hmm. So then that's kind of how it was born. I then spent the next semester, like every morning, bringing fresh bread. Everything was made from sourdough, and the idea of it, because I was studying education, was to kind of be an educational thing. So I made like some flyers about the philosophy of, you making bread in this kind of old way, or kind of ancient way, using locally produced, locally grown and milled flours from local farmers, so that it's, when you eat the bread, you're tasting something that is from this particular place. Like, it's distinctive. There isn't any other way or any other place where you're going to find the same kind of bread. Every baker will have a different way, but every flour in this area will also taste, different depending on where it's grown. And flowers grown even in the same area up there had different characteristics, even though, like I said, they were the same. They were both all-purpose flour, but they had, one had a more of a cinnamony kind of scent to it that was really distinctive when you took it out of the bag. So this was the idea, to kind of engage, students, university students, in this idea of food as something, kind of, because these connections of this older technique and like locality are directly connected to the sustainability of food and food systems, which is now what my research is about. So for me, it was this whole kind of project. It was fun, first of all. I got to share bread. I got to make a little bit of money, but also I got to kind of do this project where I had a flyer, and we did some events. Like, I did a sourdough Santa, where I brought a bunch of sourdough, and we did a sensory tasting of store-bought bread and the sourdough bread, and they could smell the sourdough, and they could smell the dry yeast, which I dissolved in the water, and then the fresh yeast, which I dissolved in the water. And there's a huge difference in the smell between the two of them. The yeast from the store smell disgusting, and the sourdough either smells really fruity or a bit vinegary and soury. It's completely different, and they all do the exact same thing. They all leave in the bread. So it's connected to to fermentation, to health, to environment, and sustainability. So for me, it was like this total package project that also I was able to make a little bit of money from. So
can we say that what we just did in the beginning, the whole tasting and describing and eating, an example of sensory ethnography? And if we can, then can you, even though the listeners experienced it by listening, can you give more of a formal sort of description about what sensory ethnography is for the listeners?
Yeah, sure. If you don't mind, I'm just going to take one bite.
Oh yes, please do. I'll do as well. I could hear that perfectly. And also, while giving the description, can you explain how you connect or relate sensory ethnography or all these multisensory approaches to sustainability, especially food sustainability? And what do you think it brings to the existing conversation about sustainability?
Right. It's a really good question, because I think it's not completely clear, right? The connection between something like sensory ethnography or studying the senses is not exactly clear how it's related to sustainability. I think one reason for that is because this it's a fairly recent, as in the last 3 decades or so, field of study, of serious academic study.
Here, I want to just cut you here a little bit. I read your master's thesis, and actually from your thesis you explained that very well. But for me, when I first started reading, I had no idea, like, how can it really be connected with sustainability? So in that sense, reading your thesis was a very good, like, you had a very good study on that, just for the listeners to understand. But yeah, it doesn't automatically bring something in mind, even for someone like me who's working on sustainability for a very long time.
Well, so my I guess my theory, I would say, why that is because the senses, or the study of the senses, has traditionally been the kind of domain of like psychology or neuropsychology. So we know a lot about sensation, the way that we taste or something like this, or hear, from a particular angle, a particular perspective, which, for example, in psychology, when they study taste, they tend to study taste as in isolation, I suppose. So they're looking exactly like, how are people experiencing this taste? And this is also in food science, in the food industry. It's how big companies make food taste in different ways, because it's connected to what people like or what they don't like. But taste is considered as an isolated, like, singular thing. But the way that it's, and so the reason, because of that, when we think about senses, it's probably not obvious that it can be connected to sustainability. And the reason, so that would be the reason. But for me, this sensory ethnography and sensory studies is very deeply connected with sustainability. So a couple of reasons why that is. First of all, this field of sensory studies, which is fairly new, is the main thing it's trying to do is bring the study of sensation out of the psychological and neurobiological perspective on what senses is. And in doing that, you find that actually, what are talked about as, like, let's say, the 5 senses, these are actually just a culturally situated representation of sensation. So the 5 senses are rooted in Greek, understanding of what sensation is. But if you go around the world throughout history and throughout different cultures and places, there are, everybody has a different understanding of how many senses there are, from 2 senses to 7 senses. And one of the senses might be talking, or it might not even be the 5 that we're thinking of. So the idea, first of all, is that our sensory orders are basically, tied to culture and place, and they're not universal. But the second point is that sensation never works in isolation. So it's all sensation is always multisensory. Mm-hmm. And that idea, the fact of that, so if you're a psychologist and you're studying just taste, well, you're cutting out all of the other factors that go into your experience of taste. So if you eat food in a restaurant, you're not just eating the food like with a blindfold on, you're eating the food with an atmosphere around you, with a particular kind of, the atmosphere is created by the sounds, by who you're with, by the sights, by the smells. It's this whole experience which also affects how you experience the taste of this food, right? So in taking, how is sensory ethnography, or the senses, connected to sustainability? So one of the main critiques from like sustainability is that, you know, one of the problems with society and the world in general is that there's been a disconnect, you know, between there's some kind of disconnect between humans and the world that has allowed, you know, opened a space for humans to kind of destroy the world, destroy the environment. And one of the kind of ideas for that is because humans, especially really in the West and now more hegemonically so, have understood ourselves to be, you know, masters of the world, that we can take from it whatever we need without considering the repercussions or without any reciprocity or respect for it. And we can think about it like that only because we're disconnected from it. Yeah. So sensation actually is really profoundly, fundamentally involved in the, I would say maybe the ontological or the phenomenological or even the epistemological foundations of sustainability. Mm-hmm. So by basically like, if you're by foregrounding sensation, you're by paying attention to sensation and the senses, in effect, what you're doing is you're paying attention to our inextricability or our emplacement in the world that, you know, we can never actually be a part of, or sorry, that we can never actually be separate from. Yeah. Even though we might think we're like, well, we don't maybe necessarily think that way, but we might act that way. But by paying attention to our sensory experiences of every day and becoming more in tune with how we connect with the world, it's a possible route to closing this, to reconnecting, to understanding ourselves as bound up in the world. And in doing so, hopefully the idea would be to create the possibility where attention to sensation and our being in the world helps us to think through how to act in the world in a more respectful, regenerative, or sustainable way. Yeah. So at a very, very fundamental level, sensation is really, the bottom line of where we might begin to thinking about sustainability. So it would be like, rather than thinking or talking about sustainability, it would be rather being sustainable. So it's a practice rather than it's being sustainable in the world, rather than, talking about sustainability for the world, for example.
And it creates this kind of long-term commitment. I mean, it makes you kind of, I think, like not really as I see that some people are preferring sustainable lifestyles because they feel responsible and something, but there's just some very intellectual reason, like, okay, the world is going this way, we should do this like this and that, but maybe not fully being still part of it, but just believing that they should do, and then they act this way. But I think from what you describe, it becomes really your life. Yeah, like you can't think any other way anymore. And especially this kind of, I like a lot this kind of being connected again with the world, especially in the food domain. Because I'm a little bit nowadays. Especially the young people don't know at all where their food is coming from, and they don't see all these processes. And I mean,
and so this is exactly right. I mean, and that's why for me, this sensory approach became really, really exciting. Precisely because food is one of those I mean, food is it's what food and the production of it is how civilizations become large, and that disconnect that I was just speaking of, it's nowhere is it more clear than in food. People, when you don't know where your food is coming from, when you don't know what's in your food. So for me, food is, I'm kind of, I'm really have a deep love of food. I'm a huge food geek. And for me, this, the sensation of food is never studied. It's always talked about in terms of nutrition, or it's talked about in terms of how are we going to feed the world. But it's until recently, it hasn't been much talked about the experience of food and how that the possibility of how it can reconnect us with the world in which we live.
Yeah.
So like I was saying earlier with the different flours, when I was baking and realizing but this is the same flour, the fact that it has completely different characteristics of the way that it builds gluten network or the way that it tastes, depending on who I'm getting it from, even if those places were in the same area, it's different. And that, for me, that would be maybe one example of attending to the sensory experience of food, which is then able to tell me something about where my food is coming from. And, it's very different than, for example, if I buy bread from the store, and the taste of that bread I don't know what it is. I don't know where it's from. So it could be, for example, interpreted as the taste of, the global food and industrial agribusiness, like that. It's the taste of that, because it's disconnected. I don't know where else it's from. And by attending to taste and knowing taste, so taste as knowledge, and, for the longest time in the West, from Greek all the way to Rene Descartes, and especially with Immanuel Kant, who basically said, vision is like the most knowledgeable of the senses, and smell and taste, you can't get any knowledge from them. But actually, you of course you can. It's preposterous to think that there's no knowledge in taste. So the thinking of the study or the attention to taste and sensation, if you attend to it as a form of knowledge, then all of a sudden that you begin finding knowledge. The problem is that it hasn't been considered something that contains knowledge. So it hasn't been framed that way, for example, in education, which is where I first came into this. And in doing research, in doing sensory ethnography, for example, by attending to sensation, the way that people perceive, in ways that they can't express, but also in the categories that they use to talk about it. So the five senses, for example, but by following those in sensory ethnography, you begin to understand, or you begin to different ways of knowing the world begin to reveal themselves that are impossible to see if you're not attending to how people are, sensing or are experiencing their everyday life via sensation. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's a really profound and exciting way of not only living or being, because as a sensory ethnographer, you also have to do that. You have to embody that through and through. Mm-hmm. And you have to, so for me, that it's just a really exciting possibility for a different kind of knowledge, which I find very profound for, the potential of thinking about sustainability, or thinking with sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Talking about what we talked a little bit about your thesis, but you went you did your field work in an eco village in Italy. And it was very interesting to read. So can you talk a little bit about this eco village? that you visited, and maybe a few of the most memorable, most interesting learning moments you had there.
Yeah, sure. It was a really, profound experience, to say the least. It actually, when I first started connecting with them, I was still in the, I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to do this research. But as I started getting closer to going there and I was reading more, it became more and more clear that, I could do sensory ethnography about, like, on this eco-village. The eco-village was, the sort of baseline of the eco-village is the farm that they, the farm grows food. It's connected to the community. They sell it in local farmers markets, and they have all these things. So it's, the eco-village kind of operates through and around food. That's the central sort of mechanism. And I was interested at that time, because I was studying education, how people learn about sustainability through these, like, the everyday encounters on the farm. Because the farm is a biodynamic. It's not, I guess it would be agroecological. They use a lot of different methods for growing. They use biodynamic methods. They use permaculture methods. They use, the people from the area have, in Piemonte, they've been there for generations as farmers. So there's already a lot of really deep knowledge that is embedded there. So they use all different kinds of methods, but the point is to be regenerative of the soil, right? To build soil rather than destroy it. And in doing so, you could say that's a practice of sustainability in this. And when you learn how to farm that way, and you think about sensation, if you follow sensation in that context, you then begin to understand what learning about sustainability, learning what sustainability is and how it is made every day through these farming practices, then becomes, if you didn't follow these everyday practices, and particularly sensation is kind of the marker that kind of puts things in a concrete way of representing them. But then, so I was there for about 2 months, and I think the thing that comes to mind the most is picking peaches. Picking peaches was something we did nearly every day. There were 5 or 6 different types of peaches, and there were a couple little areas on the farm that had different peach trees, and they all become ripe at different times. And you have to prune some of the peaches, like pull off the ones that aren't going to grow, and then when they get ready, you have to pick them on the right day, because at the farm they would pick them ripe and then take them immediately to be sold, as opposed to, in the industry, you pick a peach like 2 months before it's ripe, but then it ripens off the tree. So so we're going there every day in the morning, and first thing you do is grab a peach and you eat it. And it's really important part of the process of picking peaches is eating them, because it informs you of how a peach is ripe and how to tell it's ripe. Mm-hmm. What it feels like when you, not only what it looks like, but what it feels like and what it smells like. And then, finally the tasting it is like the final confirmation, right? So like you could, for example, the practice of picking peaches is a really, multisensory experience. So, at first it might seem like, picking peaches is based on your sight, because you're looking at a peach and you're looking for a peach that's mostly orangish, some of these peaches maybe it's yellowish in some spot, but so that would be the first thing, like, okay, you might see a peach and think like, okay, that one looks ripe. So the second thing you do is, you well, first thing I would say is like, how do you know a peach is ripe just by looking at it? Well, you could start to make that assumption only if you've ever tasted a peach before. Mm-hmm. So you know that biting into a red or orange peach is a pleasing sensation, right? It has that this peachy texture and the juiciness, and it makes a particular sound when you eat it, as opposed to eating like a peach that's not ripe yet. It's a completely different sound. So all of these attributes have already happened to the point where I can look at the peach and make a guess, like, oh, that looks ripe. So already, just by looking at the peach, it's already a multisensory. You're already drawing from a multisensory history and memory of experience. Yeah. So you look at the peach, then you feel it to see if it's a bit tender and soft, and if it feels too hard, I might leave it, might wait for the next day. But if it feels just like it's giving way a little bit when I squeeze it, then okay, if I can, I'll try to get my nose up to it to smell, like, is it giving off that aroma that's like, that says like, oh, I'm ripe, eat me right now. If those things, then I'll pull it off. And if it was like the beginning of the peach picking, I might bite into it, because occasionally you might bite into one, you might think it's ripe, but when you bite into it, you might feel like, oh wait, it's not quite there. So, but doing that again every day, at a certain point, you become really skilled at picking peaches that are ripe. And there was this really this fantastic moment where there was another guy who had just come to the farm as a volunteer. He had just been there for a few days, and we were out picking peaches, and we were supposed to put, the farm director told us to pick, peaches just from this row, because we don't want to pick peaches from the other row yet. It still needs like another week or so. And so we picked all the peaches that we could, but the other guy was like, "Oh, I think these ones are ripe over here," and we were saying, "Well, he told us not to pick them, and they still look a little, they're starting to turn orange, but they still not quite ripe." But he chose not really to listen to us, so he came back up to the house, like 45 minutes later, with like 4 crates of these peaches that he wasn't really supposed to pick. And I was like, are you sure those are ripe? And he was like, yeah, of course they are. Like, look at them. And I was like, okay, so did you taste them? And he's like, no, but here. And he grabbed one and he put it in his mouth and he bit down, and the sound that it made was it was like an apple. Yeah. And the face that he made, this really bitter, like, he spit it out, and you saw on his face that he's like, oh man, these are not ripe. And then, those peaches that he picked, they ended up going rotten because they were picked too early and they couldn't be sold. And yeah, so that was a really interesting moment. It really
was, because as I was asking this question, I had this story in my mind. It's particularly so it's interesting that you also chose it yourself. But then, what is next for you?
Yeah, what's next? Well, I'm still in the process of looking for funding for this research project. So basically the project is, part of it is going back to this eco-village in Italy, and part of it is doing a similar research here in Helsinki. It's no longer about like education and learning, but it's about it's more about, I guess you could say, regional or local development of food systems, and how these, different, like, let's say, local actors in the food systems that are trying to do things in sustainable ways or regenerative ways, particularly rooted in agriculture, but also connected with food processing and food distribution and stuff. If a distributor wants to connect local agroecological farmers with, you know, consumers locally who want them, then that would be one of the people that I would want to work with. So seeing how this ecosystem that's developing here in Helsinki quite robustly and has been in place in Italy for quite a while and is always still developing. So seeing how these local regional food systems are developing amidst a few things. So amidst within a market that is basically saturated by food and global agribusiness. Yeah. So the question is, like, how can these small regenerative farms be economically viable in such an environment? Then how these people who are pursuing sustainability, how are they reacting, or what are the challenges that are posed by climate change and you know, biodiversity loss, etc., and also now the pandemic. So these different factors are there. They're hanging there, but they're not just hanging there. They're very present in our lives, even if we can't see them or touch them or feel them. In the case of climate change, they very well may be felt. You know, the way that the weather changes and affects the way that food is grown, and the way that the operations of food for growing and producing, distributing, etc., are affected by these kinds of things. So I'm hoping to look at these kinds of processes, and from this sensory perspective, you know, the idea is to uncover sort of overlooked ways of practices that these people are engaging in, which would be much more difficult or impossible to see from a more traditional, you know, scientific approach. But that said, you know, there's another tool that I wanted to develop, which is kind of helps to map or paint a picture of what the local food system ecosystem looks like, the links between it, and it's about resiliency. So, like, are the links and the actors in the system, you know, are they linked together in ways that create resiliency in the face of a pandemic, or in the face of shocks that will come from climate change and this kind of stuff? So using this sensory approach and also this tool to kind of map resiliency, you know, in process, not like okay, here it's mapped and now it's like tucked away and it's a piece of information that's just going to be there. It's a tool that allows, because it's a qualitative tool, doesn't quantify. It allows for the continued development of the tool, and as a kind of dynamic thing that could then be ideally used by activists or actors in the local food systems, and also then policy, because it's really important that policy and agriculture are super, super tied up, you know, bound up with each other. So it's really important for policymakers, whether they're in Finland or whether they're in Italy or whether they're in the United States, anywhere, to know what kind of incentives, for example, what kind of laws need to be put in place to protect or promote these kinds of practices. Yes. So that's my project. I'm still looking for funding for it. So yeah, that's I guess it's part of the process for lots of PhD students.
And I do hope that we'll see one day all these policies really, or all these words turning into policies in real life. And there's a big gap between all these hard work in the grassroots level, or, you know, in different countries, by different NGOs, activists, farmers, and consumers. But then it's never, or it's very, very rarely translating into real policies that shape the global system. So I do hope that your work helps with it.
Yeah, thanks. I think, you know, the time is coming upon us when it can't be pushed aside or anymore. So hopefully it would be timely.
I agree. Well, these are all my questions. Do you have any final comments, any final words? The final word is yours.
Well, I just want to say thanks for having me. And then the last thing I want to say is this.
Oh my God, perfect. Okay, then. See you. Well, we'll see you. And good luck for the continuation of your work. Bye.
Thank you very much.